Hi everyone, my name is Fern Wickson. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you virtually today, and I'm really grateful for the organisers making this happen despite the difficult circumstances. I'm going to talk to you today about saving the unicorn of the sea, the science, ethics and politics of the sustainable management of narwhal in East Greenland. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about who I am, what I've worked on in the past, and therefore give you a sense of what I brought to this case and how I examine this case based on my background from the past. So for almost 2 decades, I studied the controversy that surrounded genetically modified organisms or biotechnology. And I looked at genetically modified crops in particular. I was interested in the environmental impact of these crops, the science around that environmental impact, the regulation of that environmental impact, and how the public concerns and debate related to that science and regulation. And after years and years of studying this debate, I realized that the debate was really not about the science of safety related to GMOs. It was around a whole other bunch of factors that included things like the concentration of power and capital in our agri-food systems, questions of ownership and control over living organisms, the character of human-nature relationships, different visions of desirable futures, competing narratives around development and progress, and even different paradigms of knowledge, reductionist versus holistic approaches to knowledge, and so on. I also studied a technology that came after biotech. So I spent some years looking at nanotechnology, which there was really a desire there to avoid some of the problems that had arisen with the public rejections around biotechnologies and trying to develop nanotech in a different way. But I looked at nanotech specifically in terms of what are its environmental impacts, and again, how do we study and know about those environmental impacts, particularly of nanoparticles, and what does that imply, and how is it taken up in regulation? And there was some really overlapping issues between both of those cases, even though they were very different and the public related to them very differently. Some of the key learning that I had when looking at those cases in relationship to one another was around the choices in the science of safety and sustainability, realizing that those who study the safety and sustainability of different types of technologies have to make a range of choices in the work they do. Choices around things like what organisms or entities to examine, what endpoints to measure, what methods to use, what time frame to study, how to interpret their results, and so on. And that these choices aren't objective in the sense that they are value-based choices, and that they're choices that are also impacted not only by the values of the scientists involved, but by practical, political and economic constraints and elements. So I really started to work with science and ethics and politics as an interface rather than 3 separate domains. I found it very difficult to disentangle science, ethics and politics in these controversies because they were so tightly woven together. So I worked a lot, and a lot of my publications are about the interface, the interactions, the interconnections between science, ethics, and politics in environmental controversies. But for the last couple of years, I've kind of shifted into a different field. So I started working as the Scientific Secretary of NAMMCO, which is the North Atlantic Marine Mammal Commission. This is an intergovernmental organisation that provides advice for the management of marine mammals in the North Atlantic. And it provides that advice to 4 member countries, those of the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. And all of these member countries are interested in and committed to sustainable and responsible use of marine mammals. That means they're not only interested in conserving marine mammal populations, but also responsibly using them as a living marine resource. That means they're all nations that hunt whales and seals, which makes them part of an international environmental controversy in a way. All of these nations are interested in doing this in accordance with the best available science and user knowledge combined. and also by adopting an ecosystem approach to conservation, which means that I still work in a space of environmental governance and one that has some particularly controversial elements. And I'm still very interested in how science, ethics, and politics interact and play out in that space, even though I now work with marine mammals rather than emerging technologies, which has been the majority of my past research career. Okay, so let me tell you about the case we're going to talk about today. Today I'm really focused on telling you a story about narwhals and the communities of East Greenland, and particularly the communities highlighted in the map of Tassalaq and Itokotome. And I'm going to tell you the moral of the story straight up, right up front. And I do that because I want you to have the take-home message with you in the beginning so that you can think about it as we go through the presentation and maybe identify it, relate to it, and see it throughout the presentation. So the moral of our story today is really that sustainability requires weaving a tapestry of knowledge. And a tapestry is woven through lots of different colorful threads. But furthermore, that the sciences provide some of the threads in this weave, and they're important threads, but they're not the only ones we need. Meaning, if we want to have a picture of an understanding of the world that is leading us towards a sustainable future, science is necessary, but insufficient. It's a thread in the weave, but it's not the only one we need. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about one of our protagonists in the story, the fabulous creature, the narwhal. The narwhal is known as the unicorn of the sea, and indeed Vikings sold the narwhal tusk as unicorn horn and therefore sold it for a lot of money. So for a long time people thought that narwhal husks were actually unicorn horns. But that tusk of the narwhal, which is growing out of slightly the left side of its head, is actually an elongated spiraling tooth, a canine tooth. And it's the only tooth that narwhals actually have. It's predominantly the males that have the tusk, but not only. So you find some males that don't have a tusk, you find some females that do have a tusk, and you even find some narwhals that have two tusks. The question of what is the purpose of the tusk, why have this one single long spiraling tooth out the front of your head, what's the purpose of that, is not really 100% resolved. So the predominant theory right now is that it is a kind of male dominance display, much like a peacock tail, very colorful, very bright, to attract mates and to show I'm the biggest, best male in this space. So that's one of the primary explanations, that it's kind of a male dominance, mate attracting feature. But that doesn't really explain why some females have it and some males don't have it. It's also this hollow spiraling tooth is full of nerve endings. So a competing theory is that it's actually used to collect and give the animal a lot of information about the environment that helps it survive. But if that was true, you still have the question of, well, how are all the females out there surviving and why don't they need that information that they get? The narwhal is a deep diving species, so it feeds on fish that live on the bottom of the ocean floor. So it dives down to the bottom of the ocean floor to feed, which you can think might be difficult if you've got a long spiraling tooth coming out of the front of your head. And they actually spend 80% of their time on their deep dives swimming upside down, which is kind of cool. They live to over 100 years old, and just like us, they get gradually lighter as they grow older. So they go more and more gray and more towards white as they get older. They're also a true Arctic species, meaning they're endemic to the Arctic. They only live in the Arctic Ocean, and they actually don't migrate to warmer waters at any time during their life. They live their entire life in the cold Arctic waters. They're really ice-associated species, so they love to live and hang out at ice edges, the front of glaciers, and so on. They're really well adapted to cold water. They really love living in cold water climates. Incredible, incredible species. Happy to have them as one of our protagonists in the story today. So the other protagonists in our story are the communities of East Greenland. So I want to tell you a little bit about them too. So it's first off important to say that East Greenland is quite distinct from West Greenland in the sense that it has a unique culture and it has a unique language. And Tassalaq, this first community, it's the largest community in East Greenland, has about 2,000 inhabitants. It is isolated in the sense of there are no roads in or out of this community. The community is not connected to anywhere else by road. The airport is on another island, so if you want to get to Tassalak, you fly to the closest airport, but then you still have to take a helicopter or a boat to get to the community. If you take the boat, it's only available 2 or 3 months of the year when the fjord around the community is not frozen. That also means that the ships that come in and bring food supplies into the community are only able to come 2 or 3 times during the year. In those months when it's not frozen. It's such an exciting event. They're often met by kayakers, and there are cannons set off in the village to celebrate the arrival of food. So you can imagine how limited that food is and how expensive that food is and how it has to last for the entire year when it arrives. Even more remote is Ittoqqortoormiit. It is 800 kilometers further north of Tassilak. And in fact, there aren't any other human settlements around. So that means the people who live in Ittoqqortoormiit, there are 450 people roughly who live there, that they have almost 1,000-kilometer radius around them before the other human settlements are there, which is quite incredible. The area to the north of Ittoqqortoormiit is a national park. It's the largest national park in the world, the Northeast Greenland National Park. And Ittoqqortoormiit sits on the Scoresby Sound, the largest fjord system in the world. It's the remotest community in the Western Hemisphere. And it's really, not only are there no roads in or out of this community, there's also no cars in the community. And it's the same deal in the sense that the airport is not directly in the community. You have to use a helicopter to get from the community to the airport. The ships bringing food supplies only come in the 2 months in which the fjord area is not frozen. So that again, there is limited food supply, limited access coming into the community. Despite that though, both of these communities are surrounded by rich natural resources, and both Indigenous communities are still heavily dependent on hunting. They still hunt a lot of the food to get them through those long winter periods. And one of the animals that they hunt is the narwhal. And so with the narwhal, they're not primarily eating the meat. What they're primarily interested in is what's called the matak, which is the layer of skin and blubber. And this layer is considered a real delicacy to the local people, and it's used a lot in celebrations, special gatherings. It's really high in vitamins and minerals as well. Supposedly tastes like hazelnuts. I can't confirm that. I've never tried it. But it's really an important food source and an important delicacy and a cultural resource for the communities there. It's also an economic resource. The hunters that hunt narwhal can earn a whole year's salary off their narwhal hunt because it is such a valuable item in the communities. So what I want to tell you now is about the narwhal, links between the narwhal and the communities in East Greenland and NAMMCO, because narwhal hunting in East Greenland is regulated by the government of Greenland. It's been a quota on narwhal in East Greenland since around 2009. It's regulated by the Ministry of Fisheries, Hunting and Agriculture. And it's also regulated by season. You have to have a license, first of all, to hunt. And there's a certain amount of animals that are allowed to be taken in the different communities. But it's also regulated by season, when you can hunt, and by weapon. You have to have a certain kind of weaponry to hunt the narwhals. But even though the Greenland government makes decisions and regulates the hunt, it is NAMMCO that provides the advice on what constitutes a sustainable quota of narwhal to be taken. So NAMMCO assembles expert working groups, and it has a standing scientific committee, and both of these, the expert working group and the scientific committee, gather information, gather the best available knowledge, and make recommendations around what constitutes sustainable management of the narwhal hunt for the communities of East Greenland. And I want to tell you a little bit about what our recommendations have been based on recently, what the available science tells us, and how and why this has become a little bit of a controversy in this field. So if we get into the science then. NAMMCO manages according to 3 areas. And this is very recent. It used to provide management advice on 2 areas, but it recently shifted to 3. I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain that because it's sort of significant in the story later on. So when it's providing management advice according to 3 areas rather than 2, that is considered to be more precautionary. This is because of the idea, let me see if you can see my pointer, I think you probably can. If you managed areas 2 and 3 here as one block, and you said you could hunt 50 animals in this area, 2, 3 as a block, then you can imagine that if the community of Tassalak is here, the majority of those 50 animals would probably be taken from down here. And so if there were 2 populations of narwhal that were not interbreeding, they were separate populations, then this one would have 50 animals taken out of it, and this one would have none, meaning this one will become depleted very quickly. So if there are 2 populations here, it's much more precautionary to manage them in 2 management areas and give quota according to 2 management areas, because then you might say there's 25 here and 25 there, which would reduce the amount of animals being taken in this area. So the NAMMCO management advice is given according now to these 3 management areas, believing that this is somewhat representative of where there's likely to be different and distinct populations of narwhals. And narwhals have site fidelity, which means they do return to the same sites year after year. They breed in the same sites, they overwinter in the same sites, which does mean populations don't necessarily mix or intermingle very much at all, because they're all returning to their same areas. Okay. So when you want to give advice about what is a sustainable harvest of narwhals for the communities in East Greenland, of course, the first thing you have to know is how many narwhals are there. The way scientists approach this task is they fly aerial surveys, meaning they use a plane, they fly transect lines over certain areas, and they count how many narwhals there are or they see. They then correct or recalculate their numbers to try and adjust for biases that are there. For example, they recognize that the observers are human and they're going to miss some things. So they recalculate based on an assumption that, yeah, we probably missed some things. There's a perception bias there. There's also an availability bias in the sense that some of the narwhals, when the plane flies over, they're going to be deep down diving and eating at the bottom of the ocean. So they're not going to be seen and they're not going to be counted. So the scientists adjust for that. They also adjust for the fact that they're not flying everywhere in their transect lines and so on. So they count the narwhals, but the number that they give as an abundance is made after these adjustments. So here you see the abundance estimates that have been made based on surveys carried out in these years. MA1, Management Area 1, in some years it only covered Scoresby Sound, only that fjord system. Whereas in other years it covered both the Scoresby Sound and the fjord and the coast a little further south. So that's why you see different kinds of numbers here. Management Area 2 and Management Area 3. And you see across the board a reduction in numbers. Now in Management Area 3, you say, well, there's no reduction, there's only one number. But in fact, in the survey carried out in 2016, the scientists didn't see any animals in Management Area 3 down around Tassalak. So therefore, they definitely thought there was a reduction, even though not seeing animals does not necessarily mean there are no animals there. But there was a significant reduction in their eyes, and they weren't able to calculate an abundance estimate because they had no sightings whatsoever. So the scientists in our working group, in our scientific committee said, well, we see a reduced abundance from our estimates. When you look at this in comparison to the catch and quota levels in recent years, there's also sort of some alarm bells going off. Now, note that this catch is not by management area, and the quota, it's also for the whole of East Greenland. But even so, if you summed up this as your total abundance and looked at the catch and the quota levels, it's still really quite high. And indeed, in 2017, our scientific committee made a recommendation that the quota be dramatically reduced. And in 2017, they said it should be a maximum quota of 20 animals along the whole of East Greenland. You should have 10 in Management Area 1, 10 in Management Area 2, and 0 in Management Area 3. Now, the government of Greenland didn't follow that advice, didn't agree with that advice, found that that would be too dramatic a reduction for those communities which are relying on very limited opportunities and availability of resources, and so felt this was going to have too much of a large impact, but they did agree to reduce the quota gradually over time, which you can see there has been a gradual reduction in the quota. In the recent work of our expert working group, there was another element of the science that was of concern, and that was a decline in reproduction. And this was showing up in a number of different ways in which it was being looked at. So hunters who catch narwhal are required to report whether the narwhal females that they take are pregnant, and those reports are showing a decrease in the number of pregnancies. The scientists go out each year and they catch and tag some narwhals, some live capture events, and they're also capturing very few young animals in recent years. During the aerial surveys that they flew, they also saw very few calves, and the biological samples that they've also been taking and analysing are also indicating a reduction in pregnancy and a reduction in fertility. So all of these things are pointing to a potential decline in the reproductive capacity of these animals. Even though the animals that are caught, both the live captures of the scientists and the hunters, seem really healthy. They're fat, they're healthy animals. There's no sign that they're nutritionally depleted or that they're struggling. It's just that there's very few young and there's very few pregnancies. So this was also a concern. Now, what the scientists do when they're trying to come with their management advice is they do population modeling, where they take all that information that they know about reproduction and abundance estimates and catches and so on, and they feed it into a computer model. And they come out with graphs like this that predict what that population is going to do in the next 5 years based on the information that's been given and that has been collected over years. They also have the ability to change the information that they put in. So they change the parameters. What if the abundance is slightly higher? What if there really is no reproductive decline? So you can manipulate that and do another run on the model. And that's sensitivity testing. How sensitive is the model and your results to these different features, these different numbers, these different parameters? And what happens if you change it? And then you can see if maybe if you're off on one of them, if it would have a significant impact. You can also see whether the model aligns to the data that you've been collecting over time. And if it doesn't, you can have this sense that it's probably not a great model, it's not working well if it's not matching to the data you're actually out there collecting. So they do this modeling, they do these sensitivity trials, and then they decide which model they think is the most reliable, the most sound, and they provide advice on that basis. Now, the management objective that's commonly used within NAMMCO and is also used for narwhal in East Greenland is that any recommended harvest should still allow a 70% chance that the population would increase. Now, in the case of Itokotome, the details here are not so important. I wanted to include them so you had them in the slides. But if we look at the blue there, we see that from that population model, if you were to take only a single individual, one animal, you would only have a 57% chance that your population would increase, which is well below the 70% chance. Now, of course, that 70% chance, it's a subjective choice. You could say, I don't care about 70% chance, I want 50% chance, and therefore I could take one animal. But in this case, it didn't reach that 70% threshold that's set as a management objective. For Tasselak, it was a different case. It said that if you took two individuals, you would have a 76% chance of it increasing. But the scientists felt like this was a very narrow margin and they hadn't accounted for all the features that were important for small populations in their model, and that this was therefore not reliable as a number. They would not want to advocate it because the model didn't take account of all the things that were important to consider when you're dealing with really small populations. So on the basis of their population modeling, on the basis of the data available, in 2019, the NAMMCO Scientific Committee concluded and recommended that there be 0 catches in all 3 management areas of East Greenland. No more narwhal hunting in East Greenland for this time was the recommendation. Now, of course, that created controversy. If you think back to what what the nature of these communities is, how important narwhal hunting is, how long these communities have been engaging in this practice, then of course they're not going to be happy with the recommendation that it be completely stopped. But in addition to that, they also didn't agree with the scientists. They did not think the scientists had accurately counted, or that they knew how many narwhal there were in the oceans. There is this idea that the scientists come in, they fly aerial surveys for 1 or 2 days every few years, not even every year, and then make a calculation on that basis. Whereas the hunters, they've lived there for generations, they're out there every day, and they said they thought there was still plenty of narwhal in the ocean, but they had in fact moved and they had distributed in a different pattern and manner. So you had very different opinions and very different ideas around how many narwhals there are, and therefore what would be a sustainable harvest in this case. And it became quite controversial and quite heated as a debate. And I want to look at, just in a little bit more detail, one of these issues that's really at the heart of the debate, which is around the population structure, migration, and abundance in the management areas. I'm going to try and explain some of the things we know and some of the things we don't know in this case. So what's happened is that some of the scientists have been tagging narwhals in the southern area of Scoresby Sound every year for several years. And what they've seen is that the narwhals that they've tagged there, in around April and June, they've all moved out of the fjord. So all the tags that have been transmitting around the period of April, June, this kind of spring period, they've all left the fjord, and they've all been outside in the offshore areas and further down the coast, which has made them unavailable to hunters. They're not close to the ice edge. They're not available to be caught by the hunters. And yet, what we also know is that hunters are continuing to catch narwhals in Scoresby Sound in April and June. We also know that there's a healthy population of narwhals in the Northeast National Park. What we don't know, though, is whether the animals that are being caught by the hunters from Itorquotorment in the spring are coming down from the north, so whether that population in the north is feeding into the hunt or not. We also don't really know how many are actually in that northern population. It's an extremely remote area to try and get to access, to do research in. We don't know how large that population is, but we know there is a healthy population there. We also don't know whether the animals that are being caught in Scoresby Sound in the spring, about whether they're from a different population, whether there are two populations inhabiting this fjord system at different times of the year. Now, why is that significant? If you think back to this idea of precautionary management and different management areas, you could manage the hunt there according to different seasons if there are different populations. If the spring population is small, but the population coming at another time of the year is large, you could allow a hunt at another time of the year according to the other population. But we don't know that. We don't know the population structure, the migration of the animals and how they're connected. But the case is actually even more complex than that, which makes it even more interesting, right? So the impacts of climate change on narwhal are really quite serious, particularly in eastern Greenland. So in East Greenland, climate change is having an impact in two key ways. The pack ice that would typically come down from the north has been dramatically reduced. There's much, much less ice coming down. And the sea is warming from the south. Currents are bringing warmer water up from the south, which means East Greenland has got less ice and warmer water. It's not the same case in West Greenland, where narwhals are actually doing fine. But in East Greenland, those warmer waters and that loss of ice is really changing the habitat there. So I've said to you before that narwhal are an ice-associated species. They love the cold waters. They have very limited ability to distribute and get rid of heat in their body. It's only in their tail and on their dorsal fluke, their dorsal ridge, that they can actually disperse heat. They can't, like us, sweat all over their bodies. So they can't get rid of heat. So that's why they love to be in cold waters. They also have a very, very narrow feeding range. They only feed in a temperature range of about 1 to 1.5 degrees. Or that's their ideal. That's where they really like to feed. And so this changing habitat of warming waters, less pack ice, is difficult for the narwhal. But even more than that, what we're seeing is that we've got different whale species moving into these areas. We've now got fin whales, humpback whales, minke whales coming in the areas of East Greenland where they haven't been seen before. And that also means that what they feed on, their food sources and prey sources, are also moving into these areas. So the whole food chain, the whole habitat in East Greenland is changing because of climate change, which is not changing in a way that's favoring the narwhal. The narwhal is suffering and having to be finding colder waters. But because they have site fidelity, there's a question around how flexible are they? Can narwhal just move further north to colder waters, individual narwhal or communities or populations? Can they just move? Every year they go to the same place. So it's not clear whether they have enough flexibility in their behavior to adapt to and move to different temperatures and waters. So the expert group actually suggested that what the evidence indicates is that even if you stopped hunting today, the narwhals would probably go extinct in this area in the future because of the impacts of climate change. So what do you do then? Do you just say, well, you should let the hunters hunt them while they can, make hay while the sun shines, because these animals are going extinct anyway? And even though we can provide Greenland with advice on hunting quota, what can you really advise in terms of climate change? And it's certainly not the communities of East Greenland that are having these major impacts on climate change, and yet they are certainly feeling the effects and suffering the impacts. So how do you take account of and manage these impacts of climate change in your advisory process? But of course, it's even more complex than that. There are questions of environmental ethics at stake, of course. So for many of you or some kind of environmental conservation organizations, there might be a sense in which the locus of environmental value belongs on the individual narwhal. Every individual narwhal is special and unique and deserving of a life, and therefore there should be no hunting whatsoever because it's the individual narwhal that we want to protect. They all are worthy of having a life and not being hunted. But what we see is that the scientists don't place the environmental value locus on the individual, they're placing it on the populations. The scientists are trying to protect every population of narwhals that exists along the East Greenland coastline. But you could also argue that the locus is actually on the species, that it's the species of narwhal that's important. And therefore, as long as narwhal exist in the world somewhere, and they're fine in West Greenland and they're fine in the north of Greenland, what does it matter if they go extinct in the east? We will still have narwhals in the world. So the question of where do you place the environmental value is an interesting one with no clear answer, actually, and differing opinions amongst different people. But it's even more complex when you think about it in terms of sustainability, because the scientists are really putting a lot of their weight and value on assessing environmental sustainability of the narwhal populations. But of course, the hunters in East Greenland are also concerned with the social and economic dimensions of sustainability. So us as an advisory body, as NAMMCO, how do we combine and weigh and consider the environmental, social, and economic elements of sustainability in giving advice in this concrete case of what do we do about the quota of harvest of narwhals in East Greenland? So I want to pose to you, having presented all that detail and all that complexity, I want to ask you, what would you do if you were NAMMCO? If you were me, sitting in my position or in the position of my organization, what would you actually do? What would be your management advice in this case? What knowledge would you need to decide what your management advice is? What would you need to know? And what would be the practical or budgetary implications of getting what you need to know? If you think it's important to know, is fertility really declining? How would you do that? And what would it cost for you to do that? And if you were the government of Greenland, then what would be your priorities and values in this case, in funding the research, in making decisions? Now, if we were together at this time physically, I would pause my lecture there and I would ask you to literally write down your answers to these questions. And then we would hear each other's answers. We would discuss and debate where we had the same answers, where we had different answers, who in reality gets to decide these things, whether it's right that collective gets to decide those things, and all of this. And indeed, if you're interested in having this bit more sort of hands-on engagement with the case and the problem and the challenges and to help you think it through, if that's useful for you, you just pause the presentation right now and answer these questions and think it through for yourself. I, however, am going to continue on that basis, but it is really valuable to think through what would you do, what would be your advice, what would you need to make good advice, and what are the implications of that in terms of cost and priorities. Okay. What we're really seeing in this case is a debate and a controversy and a challenge around what counts as knowledge and what constitutes expertise. And it's being really clear because these are such dramatically contrasting knowledge systems that are at stake and in play in this debate, and particularly this distinction between Western science and indigenous or traditional knowledge. And these knowledge systems, they differ across a number of features. You know, there's this distinction between a compartmentalized knowledge system versus holistic, quantitative versus qualitative, written versus oral, abstract versus lived experience, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's not always a complete match. There is diversity within Western science, there's diversity within indigenous knowledge, and these characteristics don't always match completely. But this idea that you have different approaches to how you build knowledge about the world, and as a management and advisory body, you have to think about how you're going to integrate and deal with the fact that there are different approaches to how we know what we know, and how you then value and weigh and consider these different approaches to knowledge. And it's also really important that I want to highlight this is a transdisciplinary problem, meaning that what we need here is knowledge that transcends academic boundaries. So it's not interdisciplinary in the sense of it's enough to have disciplines of knowledge working together. What we need here is collaboration and mutual learning between discipline-based researchers and scientists and academics and relevant stakeholders who are living on the ground in these places. And this kind of knowledge that's transdisciplinary, beyond disciplines, is always needed for complex, multidimensional real-world problems. And I think I've tried to demonstrate that that's the kind of case we're dealing with here. And it's not enough to just have academic knowledge in this case. And that's because you have the complexity of the people who are living there, who have a different kind of knowledge, and that's in disagreement. But it's also because there are political issues at stake, there are economic issues at stake, there's social and cultural issues at stake, and all of those are relevant for decision-making around what is sustainability in this case. So what now? What now for narwhals in East Greenland? What now for NAMMCO? So from a NAMMCO perspective, what I've talked a lot about today is what happened here in the working group and here in the scientific committee. So this kind of link between the scientists that work in NAMMCO in different ways, and what they've understood of the case and what they've recommended about this case. And the next step is to move from the scientific committee recommendations to the management committee. And this is where managers from all of our different member states sit. So that's people who work in the ministries of the different countries. And at this point, they hear both the scientific committee advice, but they also hear user and traditional ecological knowledge before they make their final decision and recommend it to the government of Greenland. Now, we should have had a meeting of our management committee in March this year, and we were scheduled to have a number of hunters from Greenland come to that meeting and to present their knowledge, to present their recommendations and advice, and the managers would then have to have considered both the user knowledge and the scientific committee recommendations. However, COVID-19 arrives and that meeting had to be postponed. So it's now going to be held next year. But this is another interesting question and complicating factor, because if that management committee meeting now happens next year, it means the party, the government, probably doesn't take and implement its advice until the following year, because it has to have public hearings, they have to have considerations and so on, which means we're in a situation where it could be 3 years from the scientific expert group making their report and advice being implemented in a member country. And 3 years in the case of a declining population, the question is that enough, and is that rapid enough? But that's where we're at. We're somewhere between the scientific advice and the management advice, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, and you can follow this case as it develops. So if we remember the moral of the story, aren't you glad I told you that in the beginning now? That sustainability requires weaving a tapestry of knowledge. This is a complex case. You've got to know something about climate change, ocean currents, ice movements, narwhal behavior, genetics, reproduction, the social and cultural context of the communities. You have to know all of these things to weave into what is sustainability in this case. If you want to manage this case for sustainability, you've got to know lots about lots of things. And that the sciences provide important and necessary threads in this weave, but they're not the only ones. There are ethical issues at stake, there's political issues at stake, there's social and cultural issues at stake, and there's other forms of knowledge which are relevant and important to include in decision making. So stepping back from this case, I think that the case raises a number of questions that are relevant and applicable across all of your cases, contexts, and controversies, no matter what they are. And they all link to the themes of this conference. And so I'm going to give you 3 questions that I think you can benefit from reflecting on, no matter what is your case, your context, or your controversy. And that is, what is included and excluded in definitions of sustainability? Are they only environmental sustainability, or are they truly weighing social, economic, and environmental sustainability together? And how do you weigh those things together? What counts as expertise? Who counts as an expert? On what basis? And is interdisciplinary knowledge sufficient? Is it enough to have different disciplines interacting together? And that's super important. The fact that this conference brings together philosophy and science is a massive, important achievement, and I'm so thrilled that that is happening. I know that you're all experiencing how valuable that can be, but is that enough? Can we also consider the value of opening up to other knowledge systems outside disciplinary boundaries and other stakeholders with other interests in the cases and controversies that we're dealing with? Okay, thank you everybody for listening. I hope that I've encouraged you to care about narwhal and the communities of East Greenland, and to see how difficult management advice is in practice. If you want to know more about NAMMCO, we have a great website, lots of information about our species, all of our committee reports, all available on that website. We're also active on Twitter and Facebook. You can email me, and you can also be in touch with me through the conference. Thank you for listening, and I hope that we're in touch. Thank you. Bye.